Hey, welcome back to the pod. I hope you guys are doing really, really well. This week's episode is going to be a little bit different to the ones that I've done before because the last couple of weeks have not been my favourite of all time. They've been very busy. I've started training for my new Sunday job and, well, I finished all the training now, but I was doing 9-hour shifts, which I know isn't abnormal, but it's longer days than I've had to do in a very long time, since way before my final exams. And when you're like constantly taking in new information and learning new skills, like that's going to be tiring for anybody. And then I had a couple of like one-off days which were just ram-packed. So last Friday I started work at 7, finished at 4, wolfed down some dinner and then went straight to Hereford to do a gig and got back at past midnight. And my boyfriend Ed had 3 of his best mates over, so we were hosting them for a weekend, and like while it was so lovely to see them, I'm very much somebody who needs my own space to recharge, and I hadn't anticipated how tired I was going to feel after that day. So I fear I wasn't the best conversationalist over breakfast on Saturday morning, and then once they'd gone I was straight into editing last week's episode because I had less time in the week because of training to do the stuff that I would usually do, like as in get all the work towards the podcast done. So everything's felt a little bit more rushed. And then to top it off, I was meant to be seeing my cousins this week. It's currently Saturday, so I'm filming the day before releasing this because I've been ill. So yeah, I was meant to fly to Newcastle on Thursday to see them and come back today. But lo and behold, Wednesday came around and whatever virus or bug this is hit me like a sledgehammer, and I thought there is absolutely no way I'm making it onto a plane tomorrow morning. So that was really sad, and I've just been wallowing in my illness for the last couple of days. I've put off filming this as long as I could because I've just been knackered. It's all great stuff, and I feel extremely grateful that my life is so busy with so many things that I love, and like I'm loving my new job, and I adore the band that I play with. Like I adore my friends in it, and I love the music that we play. I love gigging, and like with the podcast, I absolutely love working on this and creating this, but it is still so new to me, and I'm still constantly picking up new things about editing software and cameras and microphones and how content creation works and how to upload things, and it's just a lot of new stuff. To sum it up, life has been very busy with lots of wonderful things, but wonderful things can still drain your tank massively, and I'm definitely feeling the aftermath of a slightly busier couple of weeks and a really hectic weekend. And because of how busy last weekend it was, I had less time to work with getting last week's episode out, which pushed my script writing back, and then I got hit with this bug. So I didn't set aside as much time as I usually do to write this episode script this week. I could have gone ahead with talking about the specific topic that I had in mind for this week's episode, but I didn't want to do a rush job on it. It's something that I'd like to dedicate more time towards. So I was trying to think about how I could still put out a high quality episode. So I'm not going to talk about one specific topic this week, and instead I'm going to touch on and talk about a few things that I've learned since starting the pod, what it's made me think about, and also what has helped me this week and what helps me on weeks like this when I'm feeling a little bit more strained and stressed and down than usual, in the hope that it can be of use or of entertainment to somebody else. So I'm going to begin with talking about what my biggest takeaways from the last 3 weeks have been since I launched the podcast. The first one is something that I'd heard so many people talk about before, but this has definitely been my first time experiencing it firsthand, and it is that you will learn so much more through imperfect action than you will through the planning stage. The amount I've learned about the actual mechanics of content creation and filming and recording and editing and what works and what doesn't and how to talk naturally in front of a camera has been tenfold through actually doing it than what I was learning and picking up in the planning and research stage. I do believe that experiences are the best teachers, and I'm so glad that I did actually keep my preparation stage so short, because I think learning on the job is the way to go, and you can't make any mistakes in the planning stage. And I think failures and mistakes are where most of your most valuable lessons are going to lie. So the faster you can make them, the better off you're going to be. I think there is a lot to be said for getting comfortable with failing fast. There are just so many things that I couldn't have and didn't know how they were going to work until I actually did them and like tried them out through action. So I could have spent months planning how I was going to approach this project and how it was all going to work hypothetically, only to realise then so far down the line that it didn't actually translate into practice. So to give a really specific example, before I released my first episode, I'd never done anything more than English GCSE public speaking. I've never had to present verbally before. So I'd never really paid close attention to the way that I talk and communicate. And as soon as I recorded my first episode and listened to it back, I started picking up on absolutely everything that I was doing quote unquote wrong in my speech. Like I would pause for a millennium between every other word whilst I was thinking on the spot what to say. I used like about 500 times in the first take I did of my first episode, which meant that when I was editing my first trial run of the first episode, I spent so much more time in the editing process than I thought I would, cutting out pauses and cutting out filler words, which meant that all my hypothetical estimates of how long things were going to take and which days I was going to dedicate to which part of the producing process were all just wrong. And I learned pretty much immediately that I needed a more fleshed out script to be able to communicate the ideas in the way that I wanted to. Because for that first episode, all I really had jotted down were a couple of bullet points and keywords and key sentences and like the topic headings. But that just resulted in me pausing way too much whilst I was trying to decide exactly what I wanted to say on the spot. And originally I'd thought that just having those bullet points and keywords was going to be a much more natural way of producing a script and then speaking the episode. But actually it just meant that I was pausing way too much and I wasn't communicating in a way that was as snappy and engaging as I wanted it to be. So I could have spent months preparing scripts in bullet point form, only to then get to trying to filming it and realising that it didn't work. And I imagine what would have happened is because the original ideas that I would have been having to make those scripts with wouldn't have been like fresh in my immediate memory, it would have just resulted in a lot more work because I'd have essentially had to like re-prepare all of my episode scripts again. So when that didn't go so well the first time and I realised I needed more fleshed out scripts in future, I quickly found out that it didn't actually take me that much longer to write the scripts out in longer form. And the time-consuming bit of the process was actually having the ideas and stringing them together in sentences and sections internally. That's something that I couldn't have found out in the research and planning and prep phase because you cannot research which approaches are going to work for you uniquely in an area that you've literally never dipped a toe in before. That's something that you have to find out by trial and error and by failures. And through experimentation, I've worked out that I actually find it easiest to formulate ideas and articulate them and work out which ideas and which pieces of research that I've come across are relevant to which topics whilst I'm walking. That's when I actually put most of the episodes together in my head. So what I do is when I am walking and I have an idea, I whip my phone out and I record myself speaking and then take it back home, listen back to it and type it up, ready to read back to myself on recording day. That's definitely not how I thought the process was going to go or work best for me before I started. So I could have spent months planning and writing a timetable for which days I was going to script write on and which days I was going to record on and how long it was all going to take, only to try it out and realised that none of it worked. Now I found a process that comes naturally to me and works for me, which is that I script write every day on my daily walks. And, you know, I've discovered that within a couple of months of beginning the project as opposed to a year down the line. Also, if you're learning on the job, so to speak, by taking action and trying things out instead of trying to maximise your research and prep period, you don't make all your mistakes at once. I think doing it that way is much easier in a sense because I'm building all of these skills from literal ground level up. I'm only really encountering one or two problems at a time, so I can address one, problem solve, move past it onto the next one and then carry on going. Whereas if I'd have spent a year planning and researching social media strategies and how to immediately make the most influential and engaging and insightful podcast, my expectations for my starting level probably would have been so much higher, and I probably would have come across so many more problems immediately because I would have been expecting myself to be good at everything straight away. And quite obviously it is much harder to address 20 problems at once than it is to address one or two. If you're doing something completely new for the first time, you're not immediately going to be good at it. It's like if you try and pick up a new habit, you're not going to successfully execute it flawlessly without a hitch from day dot. If you're trying to start a new form of exercise or start exercising at all, you can't suddenly expect yourself to go from being a couch potato to a marathon runner. And if you want to try content creation for the first time, it's to be expected. But to start with, there are many aspects of it that you're probably not going to be very good at if you're good at any aspects of it at all. This is a little bit of a side note, but because I started consuming self-help content years ago, before I even had considered the fact that I would ever be creating any content of my own, or certainly doing this podcast, when I was writing notes, most of the time I wasn't writing down where they were coming from, because I didn't imagine that I'd ever have to reference the information. So unfortunately, there are times when I have something that I think is really worth sharing, but I can't for the life of me remember where I heard it, where I read it, and I don't know if I have any way of finding that out. But I remember hearing or reading a quote that stuck with me, and it said something along the lines of, suffering only happens when our reality doesn't meet our expectations. And I think it's really, really relevant to this, because if you go into something new expecting to be really bad at it to start with, and expecting to find it difficult and to make lots of mistakes, actually that suddenly stops starting from being so off-putting, and it allows you to be okay with starting from literally level 0 and just doing it anyway, so much quicker than it would if you were trying to jump in at level 10 through very careful and controlled planning and research and preparation. Time for a really basic analogy, but if you think about starting anything new along the same lines as you would think about starting a new video game, unless you've got a really weird point to prove about your gaming competence, or you really have a problem of being bad at things, I don't think a normal person buys a new video game and spends hours online reading how to use all the controls and how to beat every level and what all the shortcuts are, and then loads up a game, skips the first 9 levels and starts at level 10. Like, you learn as you go, you start at the tutorial and you learn the controls as you go along, you learn how to be good at the game, you don't expect yourself to get perfect scores first time round. So why would you expect the equivalent of yourself when you're trying something new in real life? If you expect and permit yourself to be bad at things, you will probably make so much more progress so much more quickly. I came across an Instagram post a few days ago about perfectionism, which links perfectly to this. I'm going to make an Instagram story highlight from now on for each of my episodes, where I can upload any post or podcast episodes or sources or anything relevant to anything that I've mentioned. So I'll reshare it there, and my link tree is in my bio as always. You can access my Instagram from there. But my interpretation of the post was that perfectionism can actually be a coping mechanism. It talked about how perfectionism keeps us from being seen by keeping us in the planning and research and preparation phase, because if we're never seen, there's no possibility of us being criticised or judged or rejected in any way. It listed overthinking and preparing to start as ways in which we do this, and it ended by saying that perfectionism isn't protecting you, it's keeping you invisible whilst masking itself as having high standards, and that makes so much sense to me. I have always wondered personally whether perfectionism is a form of overcompensation for feelings of inadequacy, in the sense that you have to be constantly aiming to be the best because maybe your brain thinks that that's the most effective way of ensuring that you never fall short. It goes along the same lines as the way I used to think about working and productivity, because I think I used to say to myself, well, if I just spend the maximum amount of time that I can working and being productive, then nobody, including myself, could ever question whether I could have done more or whether I could have achieved more if I'd have put in more hours. You know, nobody could have questioned whether I was working hard enough. I think certainly for me sometimes still, and maybe for other people, you can get stuck in thinking that if I'm always aiming for perfection, then I reduce my chances of not being good enough. And I think this post almost added like another step to my thinking process of, well, if you ensure that you never start by staying in the planning and preparation phase, then you eliminate your chances of not being good enough completely. And I think the really dangerous thing potentially about staying in the planning and preparation phase is that you convince yourself that you're doing something productive and that you're working towards your goal and that you'll start eventually, but without a solid and movable deadline that you know you're going to be able to hold yourself to, you risk never getting out of that zone. and then none of it has been productive whatsoever, and you've just told yourself a comforting lie that you've been working towards something that you'll actually never start. But falling short or being bad at something is only a big, bad, scary thing if you're subconsciously or consciously tying your worth to your achievement or performance in that area. If you can work towards accepting the fact that being really bad at something to start with, and potentially for a long time after starting, is a really important and unavoidable part of the process, and that it doesn't say anything about you as a person or your talent or your ability to build skills, and it doesn't say anything about the limitations on how good you could get at it in the future, there's then a good chance that you'll reduce the negative emotions that you feel coming up around it. And the friction that you then feel between yourself and starting the new big scary thing will decrease massively. Additionally, taking action and learning as I go has given me an undeniable stack of proof and so much confidence that I can work out how to do new things, and that they do get easier with time and repetition. The more proof I build of this, the stronger the message is that I send to my brain that I can learn new things, and so the stronger my self-belief becomes, and then the easier it is for me to continue to learn. It's a really, really positive feedback loop. If anything is coming to mind for you personally as you're listening to me talk about this, something that you've been thinking about starting or trying for a long time, but that you've been holding yourself back from or keeping yourself in the planning stage for, take this as your sign to just go for it, and I will be cheering you on from over here. You can do it, you absolutely should do it, and if it goes for you anything close to the way it's gone for me, your confidence will absolutely skyrocket with every mistake that you make and overcome and problem solve along the way. Because you learn that it doesn't say anything about you as a person, and it's through the mistakes and the screw-ups that you learn and improve. Also, your self-worth is a subjective social concept, so if your aversion to falling short or not being good enough in the effort to protect your sense of self-worth is keeping you back from starting, just bear that in mind. The only one with the power to determine your self-worth is you. It's a subjective measurable, and therefore I don't think decisions should be made based off of it. But that's a very long conversation for another day. Also, just before I move on from this, something that I think is worth saying from my experience already is that new skills get so much quicker and easier with time and noticeably less tiring. Because actively doing something and making decisions and thinking about what you're doing, which you have to really think about what you're doing when it's something new, takes so much more effort and energy. Whereas when something becomes habit, it doesn't take anywhere near as much mental energy anymore because you're not having to constantly be making decisions. A habit is an almost, if not entirely, automatic behaviour. Your brain is responding to a cue with its learnt response. So the things that feel really new and difficult and knackering now, given adequate time and patience, will get so much less tiring. That bit has been a really key realisation for me because I think lots of us are already aware that skills with practice will get easier, but we underestimate how much mental energy we free up and stop relying on when things become habitual practice and routine, and therefore how much less tiring they become. So with time, you'll start to get a lot more bang for your buck energy-wise. Lesson that I've learned firsthand since starting my podcast number 2. Again, something that I've heard so many times, but this was one of my first times really experiencing it firsthand, and that is that so much of what we worry about never happens. And a really good way to tell whether something is a legitimate worry or not is to ask yourself, does it start with a what if? And I think personally, if it starts with a what if, it's probably not a worry that's worth a lot of your time. At the end of my first episode, I spoke a little bit about how scared I was to put this podcast out on the internet, and how there was a part of my internal voice that was constantly shouting at me and going, oh, but what if this is embarrassingly bad, and what if everybody you know reaches out and is like, Anya, this is stupid, you can't be talking about these things on the internet. Want to know how many people have messaged me to say that? None. Want to know how much negative reception I've had? Absolutely none. The worst thing that has happened to me so far is that somebody commented on one of my YouTube videos and asked if I had an OnlyFans, and I just laughed. I cried a little bit internally, but then I just laughed. The only messages that I've had have been full of love and support. And it reminded me of something that I personally think is true, which is that generally people are quite nice, and even if they're not like outwardly loving and warm and kind, most of the time at least they're not arseholes. From what I understand of human psychology, from the multitude of self-help and psychology related content that I've consumed over the years, and from different therapists, Humans all have a negativity bias. That's an evolutionary trait because spotting potential dangers like predators was and still is integral to our survival. So it's vital information for the brain to pick out from the constant barrage of information that we're being exposed to. Whereas picking up on the positives in our environment, like potential food or potential shelter or a potential mate, is still important, but it's not completely essential, or at least it's not immediately essential from a survival standpoint. Whereas if you see a lion coming towards you, you need to know about it immediately. We also all, to an extent, have an inbuilt fear of rejection because back in the caveman days, if we were rejected from our tribes, our chances of survival were slimmed down significantly. So again, fitting in and being socially accepted was integral to our survival. So of course, it's completely natural for us to try and preempt any potential social rejection. And sometimes that looks like asking ourselves what if questions, like what if I do XYZ action and people don't like it and people judge me for it and then people don't like me personally because of it. Because your brain fears people not liking you because it recognises it as a form of rejection and then consequently fears for your survival. But that's Stig talking, and if you don't know who Stig is, go back and listen to my second episode to get a better understanding. But to summarise, Stig is the name that I've given to my lower brain, which is the part of our brain which is concerned with our immediate survival, often at the expense of what's actually in our best interest because to an extent it's operating from an outdated manual. If we get rejected by a certain individual or even a specific social group now, yes, it can be really, really painful and it sucks, and the resulting loneliness in itself can be dangerous. But we're not cavemen anymore, we're living in a completely different world, and in many ways we are much more socially connected now, which opens up so many more social opportunities for us, and we no longer now depend on one specific group for our survival. Although it's not always preferable, most of us can live and support ourselves alone. So as much as Stig will have you believing otherwise, we are not going to die if somebody mocks us for posting something on social media. Again, if you want any more info on how I personally manage this part and aspect of my brain and thought processes, head back to episode 2. That's where all the juicy info is. Following on from this, another idea that I personally really believe in is that words can only hurt you to the extent to which you believe them. It's something I've heard spoken about by multiple people. I can't remember who I heard it from originally, but certainly Michael Smoke talks about it a lot. I've mentioned him in previous episodes, and his podcast link will be in the episode description to this one. So if you are scared of somebody thinking or saying something unpleasant about you when you try and start a new thing, I think the best way to protect yourself from that is to work out whether there's any truth to it. But if there's not, try and work through why you're holding on to that untrue belief about yourself, and then try and work out how you're going to let go of it. I just had a fat tea break. My boyfriend, bless his heart, he's in the other room. Our flat's quite small, so like whatever noise he makes next door in my bedroom, like you'd be able to hear it in here. So usually I try and record when he's out, but we're both in today, and he's also been ill. He's really snotty, and he just came in when I took a pause and was like, "Can I blow my nose?" I'm so tired. I can't wait until bedtime tonight. I can't wait to be better again. This sucks. But thanks for being here and keeping me company and listening. Back to what I was talking about that was actually useful. Something that I practice that really helps me with this, with working through my opinions about myself that aren't necessarily objective fact, is a part of my evening journaling routine, which I got from one of Ryan Clarkin's TikToks. Shout out to him. He's a self-help and business-related content creator, and he also has a podcast called the Ryan Clarkin Mindset Podcast. I've not consumed anywhere near as much of his content as I have, say, Shelby's or Michael Smoke's, but I've listened to a few of his podcast episodes and I see his TikToks occasionally, and some of them have been really valuable. When I write this out in my journal, I write limiting belief transformation as a little subheading. I don't think that's what he referred to the practice as, but it's the name that I've kind of given it for myself. What you do is you choose a belief that hasn't been serving you or your best interest, you write it out as a statement, and then you put a line for it and write down all the reasons why that isn't true underneath. Then write a new, empowering, true statement that you want to replace this belief with, and if you want to reinforce it even further, you can go ahead and list all the reasons why this new belief is true. I don't do this every single day. I only do it on the days where something comes to mind that I think could be useful to work through, or when there's something that is noticeably affecting me. So some weeks I do it every day, some weeks I don't do it at all. But on weeks like this one, when I'm feeling really run down, things that wouldn't usually bother me can end up feeling really exaggerated, and sometimes old unhelpful thought patterns can more easily creep back through for me. So in times like this, I find it especially useful. On to some other stuff that's helped me out in these last couple of weeks. I find knowing what's going on in my brain and body really useful because it helps me to remove some of the emotion from it, or at least reduce the intensity of my emotions. I think there is a difference between trying to suppress your feelings and trying to understand from a logical and rational perspective why you might be feeling a certain way. I've let myself feel wobbly and stressed this week. I've talked it through with my boyfriend and a close friend. I've never at any point said to myself, you need to stop feeling stressed or anxious. I've just found that knowing and understanding why I'm feeling a certain way, and the reason I'm having stronger reactions to a lot of things that wouldn't usually bother me, is because I'm more mentally run down and tired, and I have a lower mental and emotional capacity than I usually would have, helps me to accept it. And once I've accepted it, I can adjust my expectations myself and therefore reduce the intensity of said unpleasant emotions. If you picture your internal tank on a day where you've had a great day and a great week and you're feeling good, it's going to be pretty close to full. So even if somebody says something minor that upsets you a little bit, it might deplete the contents of your tank slightly, but it's still going to be really full and you're going to feel great. Whereas if your tank is super run down because you've spread yourself too thin, or you're too tired, or lots of other things have happened to deplete the contents of it already, like getting sick, the same minor depletion of the contents of your tank can feel like a much bigger and worse event because you're left feeling so much lower after it. And I think when your tank is running close to empty, it's going to be so much more noticeable when it gets drained just that little bit further. Whereas if it's close to full, you might not notice if a bit goes missing. It's going to be so much more noticeable if you're stood in a room with 5 other people and one person leaves, as opposed to being stood in a room with 1,000 other people and one person leaving. Keeping that in mind helps me to stop myself from overthinking and getting disproportionately upset over events that, to put it simply, just aren't that deep. Like, I'm not feeling this bad because of one thing that one person said to upset me. I'm feeling this bad because of the accumulation of tank depleters that have occurred over the last 2 weeks. This way I stop myself from putting all of my focus on trying to solve a problem that isn't actually the cause of how I'm feeling, and or getting undeservedly upset with my friends. I want to go back quickly to the idea I mentioned earlier, which was that suffering only happens when reality doesn't meet or align with our expectations. It really stuck with me because I think a lot of the time when we get really upset about the way that our week's gone, it's because we think that it should have gone a different way. Whereas if you can accept and come to expect that not every week is going to be your favourite, and that you are going to experience heightened emotions when your tank is more run down, it might help you to avoid getting into an emotional sinkhole. Literally just saying to myself internally, or journaling something along the lines of, this week hasn't been my favourite, I had a social interaction a few days ago which has left me feeling a bit anxious. I'm questioning whether I did something wrong or whether this person's pissed off with me, but I know I'm only ruminating on it because I feel so down, and if it had been on a different week where I'd had a better week and I was feeling in a more positive, grounded mood, I wouldn't give it a second thought. Just saying that to myself goes a long way for me personally. Something else that I've been doing to try and validate my own feelings this week is just acknowledging how tiring new routines in themselves can be. And this kind of links to what I was saying earlier about how learning new skills gets so much easier with time because it becomes less tiring. Like having to live to a slightly different schedule for my new job has been tiring in itself without the added challenge of the training itself on top. Like, because I'm used to getting up at 5 and doing my morning routine for like the first 4 hours of the day, because my shifts have been starting at 7 or 7:30, it's meant that I've had to make more active decisions about when I'm going to do things. Because, like, for instance, I've not been exercising before work because I wanted to make sure I was prioritizing having a slow morning, but then I'm having to make decisions about when later in the day I'm going to do it. So the cues for the habits in my morning routine are partly the time, but also partly finishing the activity before, because I tend to do things in the same order. So when those cues are taken away or moved around, all of a sudden they're not automatic behaviours anymore. I'm having to make decisions about when to do them, and I'm using up brain power where I wouldn't usually be. And like I said before, the more run down your tank is, the more noticeable small expenditures of your energy are going to be. So if you're like me and you're starting a new job, or if you're like my boyfriend who's a freelance musician, so his schedule is constantly different and changing, and no week looks the same. Don't do yourself a disservice of underestimating how tiring lack of or changing routines can be, because less of your behaviour and decisions will be habitual and automatic, meaning you're using up more brain power making them. You don't need to be going through an intensely mentally or emotionally or physically taxing challenge like a breakup or illness or a really difficult, intense job to feel wiped out. You're not weak, so give yourself some grace. And the last thing that was helping me a lot before I got sick was jogging on the spot. If I'm feeling stressed or stuck or like I'm struggling to get up or get on with a task because I'm tired physically or mentally, I will literally stick my headphones on, play an upbeat song, and jog on the spot for a couple of minutes and just allow myself to daydream. I've been doing this for years because it helps me reset mentally. Like if I'm stuck on something or ruminating over a decision, this usually sorts me out. One of the biggest reasons that I love this little exercise so much is that... So first of all, this isn't something that is so relevant to me anymore, but it still is on some days, but certainly when I was depressed, this was really relevant. We know that doing something like going for a short walk or doing a bit of exercise will do us loads of good physically and mentally. It gets our blood flowing, it gets our happy hormones pumping, but I think sometimes there are more barriers to those activities. Like specifically when I was depressed, a lot of the time I would feel like able physically and mentally to go for a walk, but there'd be so many barriers between me and doing it. Like say if I'd not showered for a couple of days or I wasn't dressed, it would then mean like I need to shower or I need to put proper clothes on or I need to brush my hair before I go outside, and that is the bit that would feel too difficult. And especially with exercise, like doing a workout is difficult, and if you add in the additional barrier of having to go online and find one that you want to do, I think when you are feeling absolutely horrendous, any barrier, no matter how objectively small, can seem just completely insurmountable. Whereas the barriers between me and literally just standing up and jogging on the spot have never felt that significant. And yeah, you might get quite sweaty and have to do a bit more laundry than you would be doing on average, like if you're doing it regularly for 5 or 10 minutes at a time. But that's a price that I am willing to pay because I know that it works so well for me and it has immediate benefits. And sometimes I get the bonus effect of finding it easier to shower afterwards because I'd be a sweaty, stinking mess. And because it was almost a form of self-care for me, it raised my energy tank slightly, which would just give me that impetus to actually be like, no, do you know what? I can actually get up and shower now, like I'm feeling just a little bit better. So it would lead to me doing 2 useful things for myself instead of just one. In the last few days running up to my final exams for my degree, I exclusively wore workout clothes, and anytime I felt slightly nauseous from anxiety, I would get up, jog on the spot for a couple of minutes, and that would sort me out. Shout out to my therapist who sort of put me onto the actual benefits of this, because in the run up to my exams, I was telling her about how I felt so physically sick with anxiety all of the time. And she asked me whether I was exercising, and I said no, because I felt so sick I didn't physically feel able to. And she basically said, if you're feeling super stressed constantly because you're constantly thinking about a threat, like the threat being the exams, there was a chance that I was consistently in fight or flight. And the fight or flight response is meant to be followed up with a bout of physical activity. You know, your brain expects you to physically move when it detects a threat that you need to run away from. Back when we were cavemen, if we were running away from a predator and then we suddenly stopped, it usually meant that we'd successfully gotten away from them. So the brain then turns off the fight or flight response and we stop feeling sick. So if you can push yourself to move for a little bit when you are feeling extremely anxious, even if you do feel really physically sick, it can be super beneficial. And I certainly would feel so much calmer physically and mentally afterwards. So she suggested that I get outside for a run, which I did do, and it left me feeling great. But the thing about that is it is more time consuming and it's harder to stop whenever you want to, because depending on how far away you've gotten from your house, you then have to walk back. So I love on-the-spot jogging as a super simple, relatively barrier-free alternative. And to an extent, you can stop and start it whenever you want for blissful anti-anxiety benefits. I'm going to finish off with a little idea from Roxie Nafousi that I heard this week on the Working Hard, Hardly Working podcast. It was my first time listening to the podcast because I saw somebody recommend that specific episode and it was a really great listen, so I'll link it in the episode description to this one for anybody else who wants to go and do some further listening. It was all about radical mindset change and manifestation. But Roxie said that she doesn't like labelling any day a bad day, and she prefers to say today wasn't my favourite day. Simple but powerful. I think it helps us not catastrophize when something doesn't go exactly according to plan, and again, it helps us to not assign painful meaning to a minor event. So it hasn't been a bad couple of weeks. They've just not been my favourite weeks of my life because I've been much more tired and a bit more down and stressed than usual. But that's okay. Not every week is going to be incredible. It's normal and human to have bad weeks, and amazing things have still happened. I still did an incredible gig, and I love my new job, and I've still gotten to spend time with the friends that I love, and my boyfriend's taken amazing care of me while I've been ill. And it hasn't stopped me from being able to be grateful for the little things in my life still, like the gorgeous autumn trees that I have outside my living room window, or the fact that one of my friends has a cat that I get to go and stroke every time I go to visit her, or that I do have an incredible boyfriend who went and picked me up my favourite hot chocolate when I came home from work crying because I was just a bit too tired. And I still managed to make a half-decent podcast episode out of it. On that note, thanks so much if you've gotten to this point in the episode. I hope you have a great week moving forward, and if the last week hasn't been your favourite, then I'm sending you all my love and best wishes for the next one. Hope something today was useful or entertaining. I love you so much, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye.